Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon to all the viewers outside there. Welcome back to our 10th sessions of this webinar series. And today we are delighted to have a very good friend of mine, Dr. Shankar Singham, who is also currently serve as the chairman of Global Visions, Global Economic Neural Network, or in short, we call it GENN. Yeah, so the topic we're going to discuss today is on the role of global nodes and networks and on the COVID-19 responses. I'm currently serve as a professor of entrepreneurship in Faculty of Entrepreneurship and Business, and we would like to welcome Dr. Shankar Singham. How are you?
Hi, very good, thank you. Well, thanks for the invitation to speak, and I'm very much looking forward to it.
Yeah. So before we start our conversation today, quickly a brief biography of Dr. Shankar Singham. Yeah, as we know that he's also currently served as the CEO of Computer and head of a trade at the Center for Economic and Business Research, and also a senior advisor to Hansworth and Grading and director of the International Trade and Competition Unit at the Institute of Economic Affairs in UK. So currently, he's also chaired the technical panel of Prosperity UK's Alternative Arrangement Commissions, and was the author of a general theory and trade and competitions, trade liberalizations and competitive markets. So, on a quick overview about Dr. Shankar, I met to know him when I was in Babson. Right, he was formerly one of these important people that helped Babsons to move along with the international and competitiveness market. And I'm glad that I'm able to meet you again today after a couple of years. We have been not keep in touch with each other. So perhaps Dr. Shankar, on the start move for our today conversations. Maybe you can introduce what is it all about on these nodes and networks.
Absolutely, yes. So the sort of impetus for GENN, which is as you said, global economic neural networks, and I'll explain a little bit about why we called it that. Is that what COVID-19 has demonstrated, and this is the website, they can sort of scroll through it and show some of the things that GENN is studying. So GENN is really a project to look at, to enhance and to develop so-called global economic neural networks. What do we mean by global economic neural networks? As a result of the virus, coming out of it, we've learned a few things. We've learned that we don't have a huge amount of visibility into global supply chains. We've also learned that we are very interconnected into those supply chains, and we are very reliant on those supply chains. And there have been calls to diversify, to make them more resilient. In the US, obviously Peter Navarro, who is Donald Trump's senior economic advisor, has called for a reshoring of all of these supply chains. And unless we can demonstrate their resilience and their diversification, we are going to face increasing calls for that onshoring, and that will be very damaging to the global economy. It will increase inefficiencies. One of the benefits of global supply chains is they have significantly increased efficiencies around the world. So GENN is designed to recognize that there is, if you like, a Premier League or a sort of first division of zones and global cities, special economic zones, points really on the global supply chain that attract a sort of disproportionate amount of capital. And they are really accelerating trade superhighways between them. And they are accelerating global economic growth. And so the challenge for countries is, how do we ensure that our cities and our zones are part of this network. And the reason we sort of called it a neural network is because it is very much it's more like a living organism, which is why it's very difficult to economically model the economic benefits of this. And so we wanted to something that suggested that it was also the sort of brain of the world, in a sense, that where these zones operate well. And in terms of the global cities, one thinks of obviously cities like New York and Hong Kong and Singapore and London, the Emirates, also Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and there are other cities around the world that are big global cities that are in this space. What have they done? What can we learn from them around the world in terms of how they are organized? There are lessons for the older ones. So London obviously has been around for over 1,000 years, and a lot of the reasons for London's success are to do with that longevity. But for other newer places, and one thinks of Dubai or Abu Dhabi or even Singapore, there are lessons that can be learnt there. And there are in Malaysia, there are efforts to create special economic zones, and particularly on the in the Eastern Corridor and so on, where learning some of these lessons could lead to creating some of these trade superhighways that Malaysia can be part of, and that Malaysia can benefit from. So there's no exclusion from this sort of first division of citizen zones that applies, but you have to do quite a lot in terms of your regulatory system, in terms of your openness to trade, in terms of how you allow competition to be an organizing principle, to create the framework in which these zones will be effective. So that's a little bit about GENN.
Yeah. Well, let us see on the other perspective when we talk about the importance of local networks, right? So you touched about the something got to do with entrepreneurial city, right?
Yeah.
And perhaps we can also discuss a little bit on inter-firm collaborations and the knowledge flows as the principal source of, source of what do you call, perhaps technological dynamism. And then how could we challenge this by other perspectives when we talk about the argument for the importance of non-local knowledge flows?
Yeah, so this is very, very important, and I'm pleased to be back with you, Professor, because when we first met, I chaired, I led the work at Babson College on competitiveness and enterprise cities, the Competitiveness and Enterprise Cities project, which was designed to look at rather like what I'm doing now with GENN. The sort of preconditions that existed to generate economic growth, and we were looking at a range of, including some greenfield sites where you would take an area and create the regulatory framework that you'd want to see that would encourage entrepreneurship and economic development, and you'd start developing zones. And we were doing some work then in Saudi Arabia on some of their the big five global economic cities project, including King Abdullah Economic City, which is close to Jeddah, about 90 miles up the coast from Jeddah, which was entirely a greenfield site, where we were also working to develop a college of entrepreneurship. So that project is certainly very much part of this overall thinking. You talked about knowledge sharing, and that's again the neural part of global economic neural networks, is a recognition that And Ricardo Hausman from Harvard has talked about the idea that the name of the game in the world is to get brains to move. That so much specialization and so much knowledge and so many skills are contained, within people's brains. And rather than trying to build things from scratch, what you should do is try to create a system where people are encouraged to move there because it's an attractive place to live, or because the opportunities are greater. And so getting brains to move is part of this. So in all of these global cities and global network nodes of global networks, what you tend to see is a coming together of people from all over the world, or all over the region if it's a regional hub. Where sort of the brains have essentially moved. And I think there are opportunities here in terms of global cities and global networks that you would want to be a part of. But there are also opportunities for regional networks to be derived as well. And that's partly because what we're going to see as a result of COVID is there will be, to some extent, there will be a reshoring a little bit of supply chains. So there'll be a greater role for regional supply chains and a greater role for domestic production than there was previously. And of course, we'll talk a little bit about the international trading context for all of this. And the international trade agreements that are being put in place. And we can't avoid, obviously, the elephant in the room, which is the US-China trade relationship, which is really going to define a lot of the international trading system as we go forward. And certainly the US reaction to China is going to have a big impact on the rest of the world, and actually presents for other countries outside of China some opportunities that might not have existed in the past.
That is really huge things to do, right? So when there appear to be a lot of connections when you were in Babson's, when you talk about the global norms and network. When you see, when you mentioned about this entrepreneurial activity, there are a lot of roadblocks, right? Even in our country, because in our universities we are simply a body of knowledge, right? If I were to compare University of Malaysia Kelantan and the way Babson moved their entrepreneurial agenda, they could be slightly different because we have a different set of quality assurance and Babson's, because perhaps they are private universities. But we need to see how to eliminate government distortions, and how can we bring your connectivity in the global nodes and network to the process of this developing how could we do that?
Yeah, so this is obviously the heart of the issue, which is how do these nodes, and how do you, if you are Malaysia, let's say, how do you create both in terms of the capital city, how does KL become one of these first division London, Singapore, Hong Kong, New York, Emirates type cities? And then how do you use economic zones and special zones and some of the developments here in terms of special zones to take advantage of the potential for global supply chains and for this movement? I mean, one of the things that pandemics certainly do is they accelerate existing trends. We did some work actually at the Institute of Economic Affairs, looking back at pandemics over the last 1,000 years, and what we see is that pandemics, they as I say, they accelerate existing trends. Even when you go back to things like the Black Death in Europe, in the 14th century, pre-existing trends tend to be accelerated. And so, what are the pre-existing trends that we have? That we had prior to COVID, we obviously things like artificial intelligence, things like virtual networks, things like web-based teaching, web-based sharing. Basically, what we're doing now. I mean, I might have in the past, we might have waited, Professor, until I was due to be in Malaysia to do something like this. Now we can just do it now without sort of waiting for somebody to get on the plane. All of this is going to accelerate as we come out of the pandemic. And so the question then becomes for us: what else can we do? What are we trying to do? What are the lessons from those new, particularly the newer zones and global cities? And if you look at something like the Dubai International Financial Center, for example, why is that able to compete with other financial centers around the world? It's very, very difficult to create a financial center. You know, London's been at it for 1,000 years. New York has been at it for 300 years. I mean, it's not something that can be done overnight. So how was Dubai able to compete? Well, they were able to compete by taking advantage or doing the things that the other centres were not able to do, because they are already in existence, and because it's quite hard to. There are a lot of vested interests that are all sort of built into the system. So what were they able to do? One of the things that they were able to do was to say, well, we're going to have a pro-competitive regulatory system. So there are three. And you mentioned, Professor, the reduction of market distortions, and this is something I've worked, quite significantly on over the last 15, 20 years. What you can do in a zone which you can't perhaps do at a national level, and certainly something that the DIFC has done, is say, well, we're at a domestic, at a small level, at a zone level. We're going to maintain a system which is open to trade. So you eliminate some of the barriers, the traditional barriers to trade that exist perhaps in the country as a whole. We are going to make it a pro-competitive regulatory framework. So we're going to eliminate some of the distortions that exist at national level, but we're not going to try to do that nationally. We're going to do it just at this zone level. So we see with DIFC the application of, for example, English common law and English judges to the operations of the financial centre. So taking the advantages of London. What does that do in terms of what we earlier discussed about brains moving? It means that it's a lot easier for somebody who works in the City of London financial services sector to move to Dubai, because they understand the system. It's the same system that they're familiar with. It's easier for a judge or an arbitrator to move to the DIFC. And therefore it becomes very attractive. Not only does it create a pro-competitive environment which is going to stimulate economic development and growth, and it's going to create value, it's also going to attract the very people that you need to attract in order to become a successful competitor to some of the more mainstream global centers. And the other point, the sort of third element of creating a successful zone or successful economic system and to reduce distortion is to ensure the protection of property rights. So if you can convey to global capital, which is very, very mobile, and particularly as we're coming out of the pandemic, everything is in flux, everything is in change. So entrepreneurs like this. Entrepreneurs thrive in environments where there's tremendous change. Big incumbent companies don't like tremendous change. And so from an entrepreneurial perspective as well, if a zone can present to the global capital, as being protective of property rights, pro-competitive in terms of the domestic regulatory framework, eliminating some of the distortions that exist at the national level, and open in terms of trading, liberal in terms of its trading system, then what you'll find is global capital, which is very mobile, and where there's a tremendous amount of capital on the sidelines, will be attracted to the zone or node. And it will also be attractive to people who want to move to it, either from the global sort of system or regionally. So from the Southeast Asian region, if Malaysia were to have or to use some of its Eastern Corridor zones or some of the other zones in Malaysia, were to adopt these kind of frameworks, then I think you would see a movement from obviously from capital to the zones, but also people would want to move to take advantage of this. And none of this detracts from what's happening in the rest of the country. And people often will say, well, isn't this displacing economic opportunity from the rest of the country to the zone or to the node? And what we have found, I mean, our research suggests that actually quite the reverse occurs, that global capital that would not have come to the node would not have come to the country either. And if capital comes and investment and trade comes to the global node, what tends to happen is it overflows into the rest of the country, and people start looking at the rest of the country as an economic opportunity in ways that they hadn't done before. So this is the kind of thing that you can see. And we are, it's not as if we can hide from this competition, because as we come out of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is going to be a ferocious competition as capital starts to look for places to generate revenue. There's going to be a lot of pent up economic demand. Because what we've done essentially, that this is a very unusual economic recession or economic depression that we're sort of going to be in. What we've done is we've stopped the economy. We've basically put it in the deep freeze, which means we haven't done anything about the fundamentals. There's nothing especially different about the economic fundamentals as we come out of the COVID-19, with respect to where they were before. But we put the economy in the deep freeze, and so there's a huge amount of pent-up demand, and there are also opportunities for people who are looking afresh at how they operate and where they produce, where factories are located. As I mentioned before, the elephant in the room is the US-China relationship. Clearly, coming out of this, there will be a significant pressure on companies to relocate some operations out of China. Obviously, the US will certainly be encouraging this. The Japanese have also are even giving money to companies to relocate operations out of China. And some of this is not very practical, and some of this is not very feasible. But there will be some drawing down of those operations. And that represents an opportunity for the region as a whole to pick up some of the opportunities that are going to be moving away. And you're going to pick up more. And what you want to do as a zone or as a network or a node on this global economic neural network, all you want to do is you want to have a little bit more than your fair share of the trade and investment that is sort of up for grabs. And if you're able to do that, then you're going to be very, very successful.
I see. All right. So that's very much clear about how we can look at the opportunities, right? How could we seek to identify new ways of delivering economic growth to countries around the world? Now, there appear to be a number of questions. Would you mind if we can attend to some?
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that reminds me. I think because numbers of researchers and students are listening to our conversation at the moment, they are very keen to find out about what you did from the enterprise city and the model that you have done while you were in Babson. So, one of the question, please share lesson learned from the enterprise city and how actually that helped to improve the model when you were there.
Well, thank you. So in the enterprise city model, we were looking at a mixture of greenfield sites, and we talked actually in Malaysia about places like Iskandar and the city that's being developed outside of KL for government practices, and we've talked about the Eastern Corridor as well in Malaysia. We the model of enterprise cities was focused on the regulatory framework that you have in place in the economic city. So I think that is still very relevant to global nodes and networks. In fact, if you look at the ones that are successful, they generally are characterized by the three factors that I mentioned. So they are generally all open to trade. They're very liberal trading regimes, or they operate in countries that are very liberal trading regimes. Um, they have pro-competitive regulatory frameworks, and what I mean by that is competition the organizing framework for their development or for the economic opportunity? If you're an entrepreneur and you are in one of these places, do you find that you are going to succeed based on the quality of your ideas and your capacity for hard work? And that's it. It's not going to be the scales. The scales are not tipped against you and tipped in favor of large incumbent companies, because there's fundamentally an anti-competitive regulatory framework. So you want to avoid that. You want to have a pro-competitive regulatory framework. And then you want to ensure you protect property rights, particularly intellectual property rights. And intellectual property rights and things like patents and so on are even more important in this virtual, highly intellectual based world that we live in. People are taking enormous risks and investing large amounts of capital to get pure research and even applied research into things that are capable of industrial application. And you have to give them incentives to do that, and the incentives have to work. Now they have to not violate the second principle, which is a pro-competitive regulatory framework. So we do worry a little bit about some patent thickets and so on that actually prevent economic development. So it's a balance you have to strike there. But those are the three sort of fundamental things that we learnt from the Enterprise Cities project that were vital. Now, they were vital at a time before the pandemic, when we had some of the similar issues that we have now. I mean, before the pandemic, global trade as a percentage of global GDP was declining. The global trading system was not, was not very robust. We had stasis in the Doha, Doha development round launched in 2001 had gone nowhere. We weren't seeing the kind of liberalization drive in the WTO. Now, if anything, in the post-COVID scenario, all of that is even worse. We're certainly not seeing progress in the WTO. Far from it. We're in fact seeing the collapse of the appellate body. We're seeing, normally in the WTO, you have the US as a major player and a major driver of liberalization. Now you're seeing the US stepping back from the WTO. So all of these things are very troubling and very concerning for the global economic environment. And global trade, obviously, as a percentage of GDP, has collapsed again, and even with the collapse in GDP itself. So what was true for enterprise cities before the pandemic is even more true now. And I think that's one of the trends that was present before the pandemic, that the pandemic is going to accelerate. And that's why I'm very and that's really why we set up GENN, actually, which was we wanted to make sure that the opportunity that this presented for some places around the world was fully taken advantage of. Because the threat, I think, to countries and to economies and to people at the end of the day, because the single biggest problem for people around the world, particularly in developing countries, but really everywhere in around the world, is what is your access to networks of opportunity? And GENN, these global economic neural networks are networks of opportunity. So how can you plug into these networks of opportunity? And the risk for countries is not that they will sort of just have a little bit less access than others. The risk for countries is that they will sort of be completely out of this system, that this system will be driving global economic growth. And we consider it almost like a brain with synapses sort of firing in these different zones and global cities. And if you're not in one of them, or if you don't have close access to one of them, then you're really outside of networks of opportunity, and the opportunities that you will have are extremely limited. So I think that's a very important part of it. And what I'd also say is you can't, in all of this, you can't ignore the global trade position. So obviously I'm sitting in the UK, which has just chosen to leave the European Union. And what the UK is doing in terms of its external trade policy might be very important for kickstarting the global, economic engine, particularly in terms of trade liberalization, because the UK is a very trade liberalizing, wants to liberalize trade. In fact, the only way it's going to have a successful result leaving the EU is to be much more liberal, to be much more open and competitive than the EU 27 economies are. So what you're seeing in the UK is a shift in the UK's focus from Europe. We still want to have a free trade agreement with the EU, and we're currently negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU, and maybe there'll be questions about that. But we are shifting our focus to the faster growing areas of the world. We're shifting our focus to the US, to North America. The UK is negotiating a free trade agreement on a very, very fast pace with the US. It's about the only free trade agreement it seems like the Trump administration wants to actually do. And they want to do it in very, very quick time. So that's really accelerating. We can expect to see, if not by the end of the year, certainly I would imagine by April of next year, we will probably see a UK-US FTA, which will be quite deep, especially in things like financial services and digital services. Then you have the UK pivoting to Asia. So you've got an agreement with Australia, an agreement with New Zealand that are being negotiated, an agreement with Japan that was started the negotiation, the UK-Japan agreement. I think about a month ago, we started negotiating with the Japanese. And then I think the big prize here and a really significant economic shift is the potential UK accession to the CPTPP, to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. So we're seeing some pretty significant for the G5 economy of the world, pretty significant economic changes, and all of those changes present opportunities. And actually, if you look at the CPTPP countries plus the UK plus the US, then you are talking about 70% of global GDP. Now, if 70% of global GDP, there are significant reductions in market distortions at the national level. Never mind the zones and the cities that sit within them. But if you're talking about those sorts of distortions at the national level being reduced significantly, you're talking about a significant injection into global GDP, perhaps just what the doctor ordered in terms of kickstarting the global economy. So this is, and this is a trend. It's another trend that will be accelerated by the COVID-19 process, because the UK will be very anxious to obviously generate some economic growth coming out of this. The economic hit from lockdown in the UK is going to be significant, bigger than we've ever seen in terms of any other economic impact. Depression, the 1920s depression, the 2007 global financial crisis are all smaller in terms of economic depression than what we're looking at today. So there's going to be a huge demand for private sector economic growth, and we'll certainly be very, very anxious to generate private sector economic growth, because governments will be in a state of indebtedness and have unsustainable debt levels. So creating a more entrepreneurial environment in the UK will also be a priority. So all of those trade negotiations will reset to some extent if they are as deep as the UK would like them to be, and then some of its trading partners would like them to be. And I think we'll go back to the initial vision of the TPP when New Zealand and Singapore got together to try to create this bilateral, was to create a coalition of countries that were committed to open trade, that were committed to competition on the merits as an organizing economic principle, and were committed to property rights protection, and would basically run those three principles through the trade agreements that they would negotiate. That was the plan with the TPP, and I think that is the plan for the UK's trade agenda, and it's the plan. It's the background to this whole discussion of where global cities and global networks of opportunity are going to be.
Yeah. So interestingly, the focus of all of this agenda is actually, we discuss a lot about the liberalized trading system, right? We talk about competitive markets, and you mentioned also the property right protections. And as we are in the university, how do you think this work for Malaysia? And then when we talk about the focus of teaching and understanding about development on the pedagogy and curriculum, perhaps this is some of the important area that pandemic of this COVID-19 had given a lot of impacts in terms of global issues, right? And we have to be prepared on the new set of, developing all these curriculum. And perhaps when you mention about the next generations of entrepreneurs, the involvement of private sector players and also the government, there could be less of funding available in the future. So this is the time for perhaps another opportunity for education needs to look into. So maybe focus on the, pedagogy and curriculum development for universities, in particular we as university, entrepreneur university.
So one of the things that's often said about cities is that if you want to build a successful city, you build a university and you wait 100 years, because the university will spawn the kinds of thinking, it will attract the right kind of students, etc. And it will attract an ecosystem around it that will become ultimately a city. Obviously, we don't have the luxury of time to wait 100 years. So the universities have always been the center of these sorts of developments. And when there isn't a university attached, I think sometimes you've had more difficulty developing these networks. But I think in terms of the curriculum and what universities should be teaching people in these changing times, the focus will be for the world, and I mentioned it in the context of the UK, but it's certainly going to be for the world, private sector economic growth initiatives. We have to create entrepreneurial environments where our entrepreneurs are able to be successful. And what we've learned from entrepreneurial activity around the world is we've learned a number of things. We first of all learned that the entrepreneur is the same person everywhere in the world. But if you take a group of entrepreneurs from different countries, they very quickly, and you put them together, they very quickly forget and we saw this with some of our networks in Babson. They quickly forget what country they're from, and they're immediately talking about how they can, develop a product to meet a particular human need. So creating and universities being at the heart of networks of entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial activity, and acting as the hub for these things, continuing to do the sorts of things that all universities do now through accelerators and so on, is very, very important. I think one of the things that we've also seen are the development of competence centres around the world, and these are sort of quasi universities where universities will come together with more practical applications, and businesses and entrepreneurs come together to learn what is best practice in a particular area. So I think those sorts of things are going to be important in the context of the curriculum as well. Those three core elements of what is trade liberalization, what does it mean, what does it not mean, what is teaching people about what the WTO system itself, and how it impacts not only at the border barriers, but also behind the border barriers, which means how it impacts domestic regulation. Many entrepreneurs have the view that domestic regulation is set in stone and can never be changed. And actually, that's very far from the truth. It is constantly evolving, it's constantly changing because of these trade liberalizing forces, or it's going in the wrong direction because of a lack of liberalizing forces. So I think getting universities to teach this more so that entrepreneurs can understand how they fit into a changing world, that in terms of domestic regulation, we aren't dealing with a world that is set in stone, that it's evolving. And you can, as an entrepreneur, you can work to evolve it in a way that allows you the maximum opportunity to create a product that meets human need, and to meet people in voluntary exchange, which is what all entrepreneurs ultimately want to do. Competition. I think more courses on competition policy and on the interface between law and economics is very important, because again, these are two highly siloed sort of areas where you have the people who focus on industrial organizations economics, which is the sort of conditions of competition in markets individually in countries, versus the world of people who deal in trade economics. That tends to be two separate worlds. And then you lay on top of that the lawyers who deal with trade and the lawyers who deal with competition. And that's another set of two separate worlds that needs to be brought together. And universities are in they are in the privileged position of being able to break down those silos through how they develop their curricula. And so I think that's another important element. Teaching intellectual property and the benefits of intellectual property protection and how that works I think that is also going to be extremely, extremely important. There are some very tough issues at the margins of patent theory, for example, and how do you stimulate innovation to the highest degree? I mean, broadly speaking, you want to do it, the incentives, you want to have very high incentives at the top end, which you do through the patent system, but you don't want to have a system that then creates a significant incumbent advantage that damages your attempt to create an entrepreneurial system. Again, these are difficult issues, which is why universities are well placed to try to solve them. So I think that is important. And then the final thing I'd say about universities is absolutely networks that already exist between universities need to be strengthened. There's a movement of brains across the university networks, and Professor, you did that. You came to Babson and spent some time at Babson, getting people to circulate around these networks, and then come back to their homes, with the advantage of having seen something different, with the advantage of being exposed to best practice elsewhere in the world. I think that's incredibly important. And to some extent, the technology that we have now does enable you to do that much more effectively if we use it cleverly than in the past. So, I mean, there will obviously be a switch to more online teaching methods. I don't think we won't entirely leave behind the online world that we have, been living in during the pandemic. And you can use that in ways to get to sort of level up best practice around the world. So I think we will see a lot more of that, and I think universities that are in the forefront of doing this are going to benefit. And my final sort of comment on that would be, for a university in Malaysia or anywhere in the world, the advantage is going to be in identifying the interstitial areas. So the areas where there have been silos between different practices, different bodies of work, where there is considerable interface between them. Those are the areas where you should focus your curriculum, because those are the areas where, if you can crack the silo, the siloed thinking of those two areas, then you're going to see the biggest return. Sorry, you've gone on mute.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry. When you talk about this find a place, right, that had been siloed with different sort of like body of work, right? We can consider, like in Kelantan itself, well, it's not meant to say it's silo, but it's located slightly on the East Coast area of Malaysia.
Yeah.
But the most beautiful part of this state is actually it is well known among the women who appear to be like more actively participating in the entrepreneurship agenda.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So women in Kelantan is actually among, I must say, the active entrepreneurs in the country. And one of the reasons why our university is formed in this state is actually because Kelantan is known about, the diversity of its culture in terms of entrepreneurial values. So, well, just to let you know about, the opportunity that currently we are tapping from what happened in our country. We have one good question, Dr. Shankar, from our dean. I would like to introduce to you Professor Rosalina Ahmad Saufi is the dean of our faculty. So she leads the faculty, and currently I think her concern is about the global value change. Do you think the COVID-19 has broken the global value chain? And are we expecting more impact on the global economy from the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, with respect to the what you talked about in terms of the Eastern state and women, the role of women entrepreneurs, that is the that particularly in some countries, that is a huge potential untapped market that could be massively significant. So I'd mentioned earlier the Eastern Corridors project in Malaysia, where we are, we're doing some work there with Technical University Munich, and there's a competence center in East Malaysia. So I would certainly want the university here to link into that structure, because that is certainly exploring many of these concepts, and if you can also bring half your population to bear on these issues in a way that they haven't been fully empowered previously, that will obviously have a seismic effect on wealth creation in the region. Now, in terms of the impact of the pandemic on global supply chains, I don't think it's broken global supply chains. I think what it's done is it's forced us to confront the fact that we don't have a great deal of visibility into global supply chain. So if you're a company, and what is a global supply chain? Most trade now, there was a tipping point 20, 30 years ago, where most trade actually became trade between, it was intra-company trade. It was trade between two branches of the same company trading products, and that was the supply chain. What we've, and the supply chain was grew up without much visibility into it, and as countries came on stream in terms of economic development and being integrated into the global trading system. So China obviously is the big example. The moment China became on stream, the supply chain just moved into China. If you look at something like textiles, when the multi-fiber agreement came to an end, you had all these, the supply chain for textiles previously involved a lot of small countries, a lot of the Central American countries, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia were involved in textile markets. When China came on board and the MFA expired, all of that trade went to China. China suddenly became, a very significant pole of the supply chain. What I suspect is happening now is people are looking in a very sort of practical way. For example, I know in the UK we were looking, the government was looking very closely at where we're going to get paracetamol, for example, to treat, because paracetamol is one of the drugs that is helpful in treatment of COVID in a way that things like ibuprofen are not. So we were looking at, and it turns out that 90% of the UK's paracetamol comes from India. India was looking at the time at export controls and export restrictions on paracetamol. Everyone wanted, and we've seen this with PPE, and we've seen this with other medical supplies. Countries have adopted export controls and export restrictions. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of that, and that was threatening to break the global supply chain. But I think, fortunately, people have sort of moved away from that as a policy response. Now, that is not to understate the pressures to reshore. As I mentioned before, there are significant pressures coming out of the US administration to move supply chains much more domestically into the US. That is not, practical or feasible for most products, but people as the next step down from that will want to see resilience in the supply chain in ways that we don't see it now. So this is again another opportunity for a nodal network to arise. And coming back to the eastern part of Malaysia and the Eastern Corridor and the potential for a zone there, if that zone can demonstrate not only competition and property rights protection and a liberalized trading environment, if it can additionally demonstrate that there is visibility into the supply chain, that what's happening there. There are a lot of zones and free trade zones around the world where nobody really knows what's going on. There's quite a lot of illicit activity going on. If you can instead say, no, we have worked with mechanisms to ensure that we have visibility into the supply chain. So, for example, the World Customs Organization has come up with a concept called Safe Zone, which we write about in the recent edition for GENN. Safe Zone allows you to have visibility into the supply chain and allows zones to legitimately say to governments around the world, we know what happens in our zone, and it is not going to be a site for money laundering or other forms of illicit activity. That there is going to be a premium on ensuring that, and that works to the advantage, frankly, of better governed states and better governed zones. So I think that is an opportunity, but there will be great change. I mean, the world that we had before is not going to be the world that we have coming out of this. But our challenge is to ensure that it's a world where you continue to have robust, diverse, and resilient supply chains, that you have nodes that are governed by principles like WCO, safe zone, and so on. And that's the world that we live in, not a world where you get a massive reshoring. And what you started to see at the beginning of the outbreak of COVID, which was, governments doing lots of things like export restrictions and controls, and returning to a more autarkic kind of world, because that is a world where you're really just shutting off the economic engine, and you're going back to a period 70, 80 years ago in terms of economic development around the world. And that would be very damaging to the global economy. It would be very damaging to people all over the world. So I think it's our challenge to ensure that that doesn't happen. But we cannot any longer say to global governments and say to leaders, well, we don't want you to interfere at all in these zones. What happens here is just fine, and we're just going to allow everything just to continue as it was before. I think that world is really gone, is gone forever now.
I would like to touch, last 2 days you wrote about this government, right? The Indian government will bar the Chinese companies from providing any telecom equipment to state-run telcos. And you also said they may also prohibit private operators from using Huawei going forward, right? So that has a lot to do with the connections to these clashes on, the network.
Yeah.
What is your further comment on that?
Yeah, so there's several issues here, and it relates to the big issue, which is that
you talk about border clashes, perhaps.
Yeah. So this relates to the bigger issue of China's sort of role in the world, and distortions, the role of state-owned enterprises in China, and so on. So what you're going to see from the US going forward, and you're seeing this, obviously Australia has taken a pretty firm position on this. Canada, the Five Eyes network, which is the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, New Zealand, have essentially taken a fairly strong position with respect to Huawei and security, and China in general. And I think the concern from the US and from the Five Eyes is there's various levels of concern. So the first level of concern is, and actually this was accelerated by the WTO group, the trilateral group, EU, US, and Japan, on trying to deal with market distortions in third countries. That was launched in December 2017. And that has been doing work that's aimed really at China's distortions, and it's aimed at reducing the subsidies in the Chinese market. So, and as part of it is related to the phase 1 deal between the US and China, and the looking forward to the phase 2 deal, which will deal with more structural issues in the Chinese economy. There is a very deep concern that the structural nature of the Chinese economy, and this is getting worse rather than getting better, is causing massive advantage for not only China's state-owned enterprises around the world, but also even private firms that benefit from government privileges, and certain favors from the Chinese government. So there is deep concern about this. And there has to be some sort of solution. And again, I think it's important that the solution is a reduction of distortions in China, and a signal to the Chinese government that that we are open to the products of China that are efficiently produced, that lead to lower prices for consumers and more choice for consumers, and are a genuine contribution to the global economy, while at the same time we have significant disciplines on Chinese distortions and companies that benefit from those distortions, and things like national champion strategies and so on. That's quite a tricky policy position to strike, but it's imperative, I think, that we strike that position, because the alternative to that is more of the Pete Navarro style approach, which is we just want to decouple completely. And you saw recently Bob Lighthizer, US Trade Representative, testifying in Congress and essentially saying, well, we don't think we can totally decouple from China. And almost immediately, President Trump sent a tweet out saying, well, actually, it's not his fault, but Lighthizer was wrong, and we are actually thinking about decoupling completely from China. So that will be the alternative if we can't find a world where we have this discipline, and it has to be real, on China distortions. And we failed to do that for 20 years, and I think we're paying the price for it now. Now, when you talk about security issues and cybersecurity, you bring in a whole range of other issues where the feelings, if anything, are even stronger. So obviously, we're seeing this playing out in the UK actually quite significantly, because in the UK, Huawei, in the previous administration, before Theresa May and before Brexit, the Cameron Osborne administration from 2010 to 2015 was, well, really to 2017, was very pro-China, very friendly to China. And as a result of this, Huawei had been brought into the UK's 3G, 4G networks quite considerably. And so when the 5G decision was taken, the UK went with Huawei. And this caused a significant reaction in the UK House of Commons amongst a number of members of Parliament who reacted, as I say, very strongly against this. And because of COVID, and because of what we've learnt about the Chinese administration, what we are seeing in the UK is a push back against this, and I suspect a project to move move Huawei out of the UK's 5G and other operating systems. But you have to also find an alternative technology, because, as you say, if you sort of eliminate one major competitor, you better have some alternative sources of supply. So I think here you're probably going to see some collaborative work amongst the EU, the US, UK, other countries that have the likes of Ericsson, the Verizons, the other large global actors that together can create an ecosystem where alternatives can be found. And that's work that is obviously accelerating at the moment. But I think you're starting to see this, and you're also seeing this in foreign policy. I mean, you mentioned the Indian border dispute, which is not it's not business as usual. There's something that seems slightly different from business as usual. You've seen what's going on in the South China Sea. I think people are getting quite concerned about what's going on here, and you'll also see a revival in the CPTPP, an acceleration of the CPTPP as an alternative mechanism in order to try to encourage the Chinese government to go in one particular direction with respect to its state-owned enterprises and distortions in its market. So that is going to be an extremely changeable space, the whole relationship of China with rest of the world. And the more that comes out about the early stages of this pandemic and the disease itself, the more pressure I think the Chinese government is going to be under, and that will have repercussions for policy in the world. Sorry, you're mute again. Sorry, you're on mute again.
Yeah. Wait, we go back to the global economic neural network. That's your, I think, a lot to talk and explore on the new project. When we talk about the new project, has association on how you could enhance and develop the world economic brains and driver, right, of economic growth. So I would like to link this to the mission of our university. As an entrepreneur university, we need to develop entrepreneurial leaders, right? So we need to be able to teach our students how to use self-awareness. Now we talk about this COVID-19, for example, a lot on social awareness as well. So we have to link this association in the process of our teaching and learning. So to date, we have not paid enough attention to very much developing leaders who are reflective of themselves, yeah, and of the world around them. So perhaps there are a lot of entrepreneurial leaders in our universities, or not only in our universities, but the rest of other universities in the country, that talk in silos about things in the textbook. So in your perspective, when we look at your website, right, a lot have been shared in terms of what happened around the world and what is actually UK has been playing their role in terms of, you mentioned City of London, right? Now is a form of a charter city.
Yes.
And perhaps Kota Baru, Kelantan would be another emergence of opportunity we could gather from this global economic network. And from there, we are able to perhaps train a lot of new entrepreneurial leaders, and we need to connect them to new values and perhaps a passion, right? So that they are to be inspired and they are able to also create social and economic opportunity, right? So this has a very close connection to the job that you did when you were the director of competitiveness in Babson. Now we have to link this to the worldview about how could we set these challenges, right? About educating a generation of leaders who will be positive force for change, because a lot of things had happened during this COVID-19. A lot of changes have been made to see the way we work, the way we transform educations, the way still we should be able to, bring quality in the aspect of our delivery, especially because we are from university. Yeah, so I wish so much that global economic neural network would bring maybe a lot of new perspective to our universities in terms of connectivity, not alone about the global issues on our education, teaching and learning, but perhaps on the perspective of entrepreneurial culture, and see what could be the best out there and what opportunity could we harness from this COVID-19 activities. And yes.
Well,
carry on.
Yes. So what I would say is the City of London. So you mentioned the City of London, and you rightly say it's a charter city of a kind. A lot of people don't know this, and they're not familiar with the history of the City of London. But the City of London is almost the original charter city. Nobody has a copy of the original charter, but we do know that when William the Conqueror landed in 1066. He was obliged to honor and respect the ancient privileges, and they were ancient at that point. The ancient privileges of the City of London as a separate unit from the rest of Britain, and he had to sort of accept this. And also in 1215 in Magna Carta, the barons agreed with King John a set of rights for them. And they also had to honour and respect the ancient rights and privileges of the City of London according to its charter. So, and even now there are differences. The City of London, had an MP appointed until 1944, not elected, appointed. And maintains different rules in planning. There are votes in the City of London and many of the voters in the City of London elections are actually companies rather than people. So there are lots of very interesting aspects of the juridical nature of the person of the City of London and the City of London itself. That make it a model for a number of other places. And actually, it's a model for the notion that, a lot of people will say, well, you can't do this sort of big enterprise city kind of planning in a place that's already established. And that actually, first of all, I would say perhaps the most established city in the entire world is itself an enterprise city of a kind. And is constantly evolving and constantly building on its using its advantages in its charter to build further opportunity. So could Kelantan be this sort of zone in terms of a zone that generates economic activity, and could it become one of the nodes on the global economic neural network? Absolutely, I think anywhere, it can certainly do that. And again, I'll go back to the Eastern Corridor and linking up with the work of the competence center that Technical University Munich is organizing or helping to organize there. We should integrate these sorts of initiatives, because it may very well be, especially if it has a culture of women entrepreneurship that doesn't exist quite to the same extent in other places in Malaysia. That's a big advantage. That's a big stepping stone that you have there. And we would certainly want to build on that, and that certainly could be built on as a zone. So I think you definitely could be part of this new network. But, and there's always a but, governments generally, what I found when we were going around the world and talking to governments about how to be in this global network of opportunity and how to create an enterprise city and so on, we found generally governments very anxious to get the benefits, the economic benefits of these zones and areas of opportunity, but very unwilling to do the hard work of creating the kind of regulatory framework that would be necessary in order for them to succeed. So, again, part of this is, can you persuade your own government to allow you the flexibility and the opportunity to create something like this? And for countries around the world, I mean, you look at the UK, again, even very well established, very advanced economies do have an opportunity to make some changes here. So in the UK, coming out of the European Union, they are embracing what's called a free port agenda. So there will be 10 or 12 quotes free port in the UK that will be based on free trade zones with special economic zones around them. These are designed to be areas of economic opportunity. And I would say if the G5 economy can contemplate such a change, then certainly it is possible for Malaysia to do the same thing and take advantage of the fact, because of what we talked about earlier in terms of China and the reorganization of supply chains, and there will be some reorganization of supply chains in the East Asian region. Malaysia, as a Southeast Asian player, ought to be able to take some advantages from this. And if Kelantan can position itself to be a recipient of some of those advantages, then there is real opportunity there. Yes.
Yeah. We have currently, Kelantan is actually part of the East Coast Economic Region in the country. So currently, ESA covers about 51% of Peninsular Malaysia. So the other state will be in this economic region are Terengganu and Pahang, and some part of this Johor state. So currently, it houses about 4.8 million people, and they do have
Yeah.
notes that sort of like they call it master plan. And if I can just share with you a quick one, the 70 development areas that they have been planning is actually to focus more on tourism, oil and gas and petrochemical, manufacturing, agribusiness, human capital development, logistic and services. So basically, these clusters are supported by a lot of developments in terms of transportations, infrastructure, and property and environment. So it is actually making those areas viable for a great destinations of business investment and quality living. So it is actually a good point that we have discussed here, perhaps, to more about the enterprise today, right? We can start our conversation back and
Yes.
to look at the opportunity that you could coming up with this post-pandemic, COVID-19 could have another perhaps bigger implications in terms of opportunity that university can tap, not alone about contributions to a social and economic development, but in the rest of other activities that our university has normally need to do, like research, innovation, and some contributions to its teaching and learning as well. So we have come up with a very good discussion, Dr. Shankar Singham, right? To the very few last minutes that we have here, perhaps we can quick, uh, you know, maybe conclusion that you can make from our conversation. You have written a lot about the customs and city and zone development areas, right? And then there are also a lot of things you talk about in the US, for example, in the Silicon Valley. How could that give impact, yeah, in this development of COVID-19 crisis, the startup opportunity there? And in Malaysia itself, I believe there are some businesses that gain a lot of good, you know, um, opportunities, but there are still some who are suffered, and we could see the outweigh and balance of which is actually can draw a good and give a value to the economy. Yeah. So to share what happened in Silicon Valley, and perhaps some of the area of concern can give a good model for Malaysia. So we can conclude our session by then. Thank you.
Good. Well, certainly, I'd say. I mean, one has to be a little bit careful of looking at places like Silicon Valley as a template, because it really was relatively unique in how it came into being. But what I think you can do, and you mentioned the East Coast Economic Region in Malaysia, where I think there is, from what you're saying, a real opportunity to overlay the sort of master plan, which is what lots of regions around the world, virtually every region around the world has a sort of master plan that relates to the same sorts of things, and everyone is trying to compete for the same investors and the same capital and so on. And what you've really got to focus on is what is going to differentiate you in the mind of those entrepreneurs, those investors, and those traders. And I think there is an opportunity here to, assuming the appetite exists, which it sounds like it does, to sort of go beyond this and say, well, we've got a good basis, whether it's oil and gas, logistics, tourism, whatever it happens to be. We've got a good basis to build on. How do we make each of these things more attractive to global capital? How do we make these things more attractive to investors? And a lot of that is the areas that I talked about in terms of the trading arrangements, competition, regulatory framework, property rights protection. How can we take those things and working with all the other actors, the central government and the local government, how can we make each of those offerings a little bit better? Because that's the key. You have to make them a little bit better than other people, particularly other people in the same sort of region, are able to do. What can you do to make your offering, stand out that little bit? Because at the end of the day, global capital investors, traders, etc., are pretty hard-nosed about decisions that they make about where to organize and where to locate their facilities and where to develop their investments. And if you are able to genuinely show them that they will be able to do better in your area in significant ways than they can do in other areas, other surrounding areas, then you are on a path to great success. And one of the things that is very important in considering this capital is you are getting a separation, by which I mean you are getting the sort of Premier League, as I mentioned before, of zones and cities that are developing around the world, are siphoning off all of the capital and all of the investment. And if you're not in that league, then the opportunity investment just sort of disappear, and there's a risk that regions get left behind as we go forward in this world. And therefore, it's very important to make sure that you are in that league. And from what you're saying, I think the region you're talking about, the East Coast Economic Region, has an opportunity to get into that league. And we'd love to talk, more in more detail with you about it. As I said, linking it up to the Technical University Munich work, the competence center there. Let's see what we can do to create the environment where we'd love to do something on GENN if we can make this successful with that particular region and talk about how it's sort of succeeded. That would be great. And I think there is an opportunity. There's a really strong opportunity to do this because we're in a world of great change and great flux, and you're in a region which is bound to benefit from some of the reorientation of supply chains out of China.
Thank you. Okay, I think at this juncture we have come to our last minute of concluding our conversation today, Dr. Shankar Singham. Thank you very much. You have given us a lot of thought, yeah, and then whatever that we have discussed here is actually give us an exposure to another powerful tool, and we can use the model of the entrepreneurial thought and actions. We can address the economic and social problems currently facing us, like COVID-19 pandemic, and we also try to understand how could we benefit from this global neural network in terms of bringing a lot of good things and prosper during these challenging economic times. So we have very limited time, yeah, considering the hour that we have gone through, almost 1 hour and 25 minutes. I think at this juncture we can conclude, and I wish to very much thank you for the time that you spent us. It's early morning in London, I must say, right? And then we hope to come back again for another conversations, perhaps on materializing all the possibility that we have discussed today in this webinar. So Dr. Shankar, a last word from you.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I've very much enjoyed this, and I've enjoyed the questions. I think I conclude by saying I think you have a great opportunity here. We'd love to have, we'd love to be able to talk on GENN about the East Coast Economic Region as a global, as a node on the global economic neural network. I would encourage everyone who's watched this to have a look at the link to our website, which is www.globaleconomies.com. I'd also love to put this this webinar to link this webinar on our website as well, so more people can have access to this discussion. We're having discussions in Asia, we're having discussions in Europe, in the US, in the UK, and in other places, and it would be great to have a focus on this part of Malaysia in our work going forward. So thank you very much for having me, and look forward to seeing you again, either virtually or hopefully at some point in the future in person.
In Kota Baru.
Yes.
Inshallah. Yeah, so thank you very much for all outside there, my students, researchers, and all the participating friends from Facebook group, University Malaysia Kelantan. We hope to see you again. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thank you very much.